Welcome to Bible study. This is the Bible study we are preparing for Sunday, February 20th. And we're going to be looking in 2 Samuel today. And we want to pick up right where we left last time in chapter 21. We want to take it into 22 and 23. We want to look at a very specific section of passages about King David, but also, again, today we want to look at one of the Psalms that he wrote. Now, we've already looked at this, but we're going to look at it in a slightly different light. So if we start in chapter 21, toward the end of the chapter, we have a record of David's war with the Philistines. And David has been at war with the Philistines for some time. Actually, by the point in the prior chapters, it appears the Philistines have been subdued. But now the Deuteronomist wants us to go back and reconsider some of this. And I believe he's trying to get us to reconsider some of this in a different light. And it brings up an issue that we have with David that continues to be an issue when we read about him, particularly when we start, as a child oftentimes does, with the story of David and Goliath. Because here we find out that in fact it wasn't just Goliath. There were multiple giants among the Philistines, and that David and his men vanquished 4 of them. One fellow had 6 fingers and 6 toes on each of his appendage, on each of his limbs here. And each time they are struck down. We don't get a thoroughgoing story. We don't get anything like David reaching into his pocket to find that stone and hurling the sling or anything like that. We just get this record sort of told in a staccato sense of 4 times. And it wasn't always David who did it. It was his servants, the men who were around him, who did it. Then we get this song of deliverance, and I want to spend time with that and David's last words, yet another little snippet of Psalter right there. But then at the end, after that, we get this listing of David's mighty men. That he had, the mighty men whom David had. There was Joshev Bashebeth, a Tachemonite. Not exactly a name you're ever going to give to any of your children or even your cat. He was chief of the 3. He wielded his spear against 800, whom he killed at one time. Next to him among the 3 mighty men was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the son of Ahohi. He was with David when they defied the Philistines, who were gathered there for battle, and the men of Israel withdrew. They ran away. He rose and struck down the Philistines until his hand was weary and it clung to the sword. The next to him was Shammah, the son of Agi the Harite. The Philistines gathered together at Lehi, where there was a plot of ground full of lentils. The men fled from the Philistines, but he took his stand, he defended it, he struck down the Philistines, and the Lord worked a great victory. So you have these 3 characters, and then you get this list of 30 more heroic figures who follow after that. This passage, when you take it together, sandwiched around that psalm, seem to definitely be giving us a way that the Deuteronomist wants us to look at King David at this point, almost as a mythic character, almost as somebody who steps out of a storybook. As in fact, we were introduced to David as a character who really steps out of a storybook, a shepherd boy who, against all odds, picks up a sling and conquers a giant. What are we to make of David? We're really wrapping up the Davidic story. From here on out, the story is going to be about David's decline and finally his death. How are we to understand him? There is a sense in which David is that mythic hero. And the Deuteronomist is going to let us have that in these passages and others. David is a figure who is larger than life. He is not like us. And yet, as we have looked at the stories that we have read in between, as we have read them, we have discovered that in fact David is a very, very human person. He is a very real man. Well, here we have a tension. And literature thrives on these tensions. And the Bible makes use of them too. It's asking us to stand in between these pulling things on either side. And oftentimes in those situations, there is great energy. There is in that tension is our opportunity to understand more deeply. For the same David who was tempted and sinned, the same David who was afraid, the same David who faced setbacks and triumph, the same David whose son turned on him and whose friends betrayed him, and who had a right-hand man who really wasn't all that good of a guy. That same David is the giant slayer. That same David lives in a time of heroic deeds. I think we oftentimes don't recognize that we may live in such a time. For the last 120 years or so, there has been a discussion about the disenchantment of the world. That where our great-great-grandparents lived in a world that may have been filled with fearsome and dangerous things, we feel that we are in a mundane, a prosaic time. And yet, and we know that the people who are in exile felt the same way. That they lived in a time when God was no longer doing the big miracles, when He was no longer parting the Red Sea. He was no longer doing the grand things. And yet if you look at the stories of King David, other than striking dead that fellow who touched the Ark of the Covenant by accident that one time, you don't get a sense that God ever did any miracles here. In any of the time of David. I mean, you could say, sure, a shepherd boy conquering a giant is a miracle, but he reached in his pocket, he grabbed a stone, he slung it, and it hit the guy in the head. There's nothing, firebolt from heaven, miracle happening right there. It was very, very mundane. And I think one of the things that this thing is trying to help us see is that the enchantment of the world isn't always when God shows up with, lightning bolt in hand and starts zapping people, or when the waters of the Red Sea part, or when something like that happens. There's another tension here that we see God working inside this very human fellow. And yet we're going to look at him in these words, and we're going to see a hero. That maybe heroes, maybe the mighty works of God aren't always going to be found in the things that you look at and you're stunned by. That maybe God is often, and maybe more often, working His mighty works in things that the world sees as everyday and commonplace. But in fact, they are holy and they are the work of God. Let's look at these words of chapter 22. This is a very long psalm. We're going to breeze through it a little bit. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior. You save me from violence. Notice how David piles on the words to describe what God is, but it is God who saves him from violence. David has been pursued by violence. It isn't that the violence doesn't happen. God doesn't stop it. But in the midst of all those things, David has time and again been saved. If you look at those stories of the heroic men who are around David, his mighty men, they're oftentimes in danger. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved, saved from my enemies. For the waves of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. And that just describes David's life. He was always facing down some threat. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. To my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. Think about those people in exile who are feeling like God has abandoned them and withdrawn from them. David also felt the same thing. Far away, in the cords of Sheol, in distress. And God heard him. It's very interesting that David said, from his temple he heard my voice. The temple was never built when David was alive. It was built after that. When these people are reading these words, the temple has been destroyed. David's talking about a totally different temple, isn't he? A temple that still stands, even though the one in Jerusalem has been torn down by the Babylonians. The earth reeled and rocked, the foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked because God was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, devouring fire from his mouth, glowing coals flamed forth from him. And when you read this, it sounds like, oh, this is a manifestation of God, but as you go, it almost sounds more like an act of nature. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He was seen on the wings of the wind. He made darkness around him his canopy, and thick clouds, a gathering of water. Out of the brightness before him, the coals of fire flamed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. And he sent out arrows, and he scattered them, lightning, and he routed them. And the channels of the sea were seen, the foundations of the world were laid bare, at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. David seems to be talking about a storm. He sent from on high, he took me, and he drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he rewarded me. The cleanness, remember, we've talked about this, that David received from God. Not a cleanness that he had of his own nature. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, says David. And the way of the Lord is that when you are sinful, you bring it to God. I have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn. I was blameless, and I kept myself from guilt, and the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness and according to my cleanness. With the merciful you show yourself merciful. With the blameless man you show yourself blameless. With the purified you deal purely, and with the crooked you yourself seem torturous. You save a humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them down. For you are my lamp, O Lord, and my God lightens my darkness. For by you I can run against a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. All those heroic deeds, they're all from God. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him. For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge and has made my way blameless. Notice there it is. He's the one who made David blameless. He made my feet like the feet of a deer and set me secure on the heights. He trained my hands for war so that my arm can bend a bow of bronze. God's the one who is giving David these heroic attributes. And it is the same God who is at work in these mundane things of our world too. You gave a wide place for my steps under me. My feet did not slip. I pursued my enemies and destroyed them. I did not turn back until they were consumed. You equipped me with strength for the battle. You made those who rise up against me sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, so those who hated me, and I destroyed them. They looked, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer. I beat them fine as the dust of the earth. I crushed them and stamped them down like the mire of the street. You delivered me from strife with my people. You kept me as the head of the nations. People whom I had not known served me. Foreigners came cringing, and as soon as they heard of me, they obeyed. Foreigners lost heart. They came trembling out of the fortresses. The Lord lives. Blessed be my rock. And there, I think, is the word that the Deuteronomist really wants them to hear. The Lord lives. Blessed be my rock. Be exalted be the God of the rock of my salvation. He's the one who gave me all this. He's the one who exalted me above those who rose against me. David was not a different person than you. He was just a person. For this I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing praises to your name. Great salvation he brings, and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his offspring forever. Now these are the last words of David. A little oracle. Oftentimes people in the ancient world, and today, come to somebody who is dying and ask them for wisdom. And there seemed to be this sense that they kind of are living in both sides. At this moment of death, they are transcending life. And so David wrote, the oracle of a man who was raised on high, the anointed of God, the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The rock of Israel has said, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like a morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. For does not my house stand so with God? He has made with me a covenant everlasting, and ordered everything secure, all things secure. For he will not cause to prosper all my help and my desire. Worthless men are all the same. They're like thorns that you throw away. You can't take them with your hand, you can't touch them, but you must arm yourself with iron and the shaft of a spear. Throw them in the fire. David confesses that it is God who has done it all. Right in the middle of all of these accounts of his mighty exploits and his mighty men. We'll talk about this more on Sunday. We hope to see you then. God bless you all.